All right, so, did anybody have any comments, questions, reflections, whatever on, were you doing Bible readings this week? Anything that popped up and you said, hey, I wanted to ask about this or that in the Bible readings from this week? I don't remember what we were reading. We read them, but there was so much else that was going on.
Whatever you want to.
I forgot how vicious the Old Testament was with killing everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Every time you turn around, somebody else is getting it.
yeah.
Oh, I never understood why God was hardening Pharaoh's heart and then bringing all these plagues upon it. I don't understand why he was hardening his heart. Just, he wanted to bring the plagues upon Egypt, or?
Oh, it's the devil at work.
Well, some of it is the devil at work. The best explanation that I've heard, as far as explanations go, is that almost, well, yeah, all of these plagues are somehow related to the various gods of Egypt. So this is not just Moses bringing the people out, which is the ultimate goal, but this is the God of Israel showing that he is way more powerful than all of the gods that the Egyptians worshipped, including Pharaoh, whom they also worshipped as a god. But God, the God of Israel, as the one who could, you know, the Nile River itself was considered to be a god as far as the Egyptians are concerned. And there was a god of the Nile, so they pretty much worshipped it. But God turned that life-giving water into blood. So in other words, in that first plague where the waters became blood, the God of Israel said, I'll turn this life-giving water into death. And so each one of the plagues could somehow be related to one of the gods of Israel, the gods of Egypt, to say that the God of Israel is way more powerful and has way more control over those gods than the Egyptians could ever have imagined. And so the whole plague idea is not simply to punish the Egyptians and beat Pharaoh, but to do warfare against all the gods of the Egyptians as well. There's some evidence for that in the text when it talks about the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh trusting. And when it says God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, it's that nobody's ever really sure how to take that except that, Pharaoh, not real clear how to really take how that happened, except for God then to say, God makes his glory known best in contrast to evil. So the harder Pharaoh's heart is, the more we're going to be able to see the glory of God. That's a real hard thing to say, but sometimes it's in the contrast that we see things better. It doesn't really help the innocent Egyptians that were suffering through this, but to say that Pharaoh was the hard-hearted guy and they had to suffer for it, but nevertheless, that's the way it was.
It showed the common Egyptian, that their gods weren't going to help them.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And, I guess having said that, some of what goes on in the Old Testament that people lose sight of is that, you know, when the God of the Israelites is saying, here's a people group over here that you need to destroy or wipe out. He's not just saying, well, you gotta wipe out those people because they're bad people. He's saying, this is the ongoing fight of the God of Israel against these other gods as well. And these people are followers of these other gods. So, you know, you wipe out the people, you wipe out the God. You wipe out the God, you also have to wipe out the people. You know, they kind of have to go hand in hand. So,
You know, I got a question about the Old Testament,
sure.
like plagues of Egypt and all that. Is that mainly Father God doing this, or is it like, we can't include, see, this is the thing I've never understood. The Old Testament is mainly about Father God, the side of Father God? Or
Well,
is it, or
No,
Trinity?
as
I don't get
Christians, we kind of have to say it's everybody. It's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit together.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah.
Is it, or, I can't conceive it. I mean.
I know,
you
and we can't either, and it's difficult for us to conceive. But, yeah.
So it's the Trinity of God.
Mhm.
It's all included.
They're all in there, but it's God, and how Jesus and the Holy Spirit are involved in the plagues, I don't know. It's one of those things where we just like,
All right,
except to say that in the broadest sense, in the broadest, you know, in the broadest sense, in a different way, the whole Exodus, you know, in any specific, and see, this is part of the problem with, you know, when we talk about what goes on, you know, how you explain any evil event, you know. So you have a plague of locusts that destroys crops. How do you explain that evil event? I have no idea how you explain it. Okay, but what the Old Testament always said, and what the Bible always said is this. The broadest context of the Exodus is this. Those evil events were going on, but that was not the main event. That was part of the main event, which was God bringing His chosen people out of slavery in Egypt with a strong hand and a mighty arm, according to the promises He made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and bringing them into the promised land. And in the New Testament, the writers said, that's just like God bringing His chosen people, you and me, out of slavery to Satan through the suffering and death of Jesus, probably the most evil event in history, with a strong hand and a mighty arm, that is to say, through the resurrection of Jesus, and bringing us through a similar water salvation event, that is our baptism, so that ultimately He could bring us into the land He had promised to our forefathers, that is Adam and Eve, when He brings us into heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as the New Testament writers are concerned, the whole, you know, in the Old Testament, the Exodus was the salvation and redemption event. In the New Testament, it all points to what Jesus has done for us and will still do for us when we get to heaven. So to say, where is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in any specific plague is almost impossible for us to say. Okay? But to say in the broadest possible context, the whole Exodus story is about God's redemption of His people in the Old Testament. And in the broadest possible context of Scripture, that points to what Jesus did for us. And cross and his resurrection and what he still is going to do for us when he brings us into the promised land of heaven. So right now, in a sense, we're just like the Israelites wandering around in the wilderness
Okay,
and haven't made it to the promised land yet.
makes sense.
Yeah. That's why the problem of, sometimes people wonder why is there all this suffering and whatnot, and then the problem of answering that with any particular moment or incident or something is so difficult to answer, because it's like getting a piece of a 10,000 piece puzzle and say, where does this fit in with the puzzle? It's like, you have to know where that fits in. But I can see the puzzle in the big picture. It's like, okay, now we see where it fits in, but look at that one big piece. It's like, are you gotta be kidding me? Okay,
Okay.
but it's a good question. Okay, good. All right, now we're going to turn to, this morning we're going to turn to, we finished Isaiah, and the next week we're going to turn to the book of Daniel, which I hope Ed will be happy about, because he's been asking for us to look at Daniel for about 5 years, and I've been putting him off until after Revelation. Okay, so Daniel will be interesting and fun. But before we do that, we're going to take this momentary break and go to the membership topic again for a little bit that we're working through this year. So again, just to review, part one, every year we have to do a statistical report for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and we need to report our statistics as honestly as possible, and the statistics include number of communicant members and a number of baptized members, as well as several other categories. And so the Board of Elders has begun reviewing these baptized members, communicant members, and other different lists. And so we've already looked at this list and some of the lists of like which of the folks on the lists actually live at home at Christ the King, which don't live at home and they're part of the extended family, and do, and so forth. So we've been working through the list both in here in a couple of focused efforts, and the Board of Elders has, and there's some folks that we've looked at the list and said, yeah, they're part of our extended family, but they shouldn't be on the spreadsheet, basically, is what it is. Okay, Beverly.
I know you and I have talked about this several times, but I think it helps me to understand that the Synod, when they ask these questions, did not provide you, your church, a definition of baptized member or communicant member.
Yeah, no, they haven't done that.
And
There's
so
not
it's
an
up to
across-the-board
each church
definition.
to decide.
Right,
And so, do you decide just how many come to how many come to communion on each and every Sunday? How many are here and are available to come to communion? How many are in my family that go to communion but might not live here? So, I guess like I said, we've discussed this a couple of times, but it helps me looking at this to understand that the Synod is asking, but they're not providing a basic
right. The
definition.
Synod is asking for
So-
these numbers and not telling us what the numbers actually mean.
So some of this was part of you and the elders trying to understand what is a community
Right.
member, what is a baptized member, and so that's how
Right.
this all.
And then we go to Pastor
Right.
Soltis, who's our
Right.
stewardship guy, who needs to find out these statistics for us. And I hate to say this, but I stick my tongue out every time I have to fill in these forms. Here's the numbers, whatever the heck they mean, because we have no idea. Okay, so we've done this part two. We've done a certain amount of reaching out process when we've had some folks that are on the list that we've said, man, they're on the spreadsheet, but I'm just not so sure. And so we've talked to some family members, and some family members have said, yeah, take them off that list or keep them on or whatever, and so we've done that. But we still have a lot of work to do and some other things to do in terms of refining the process. And so this is one of those, and I said throughout the year we're going to have a couple of just focus group Bible study kind of things. One of them is this one on active, inactive members, which is a classic distinction that people have occasionally used to talk about people in the congregation. Another one that we'll do somewhat later during the year is a Bible study on church discipline and excommunication, because somehow that gets dragged into this conversation as well, even though that's not part of the statistical report. How many people did you excommunicate this last year? But that's part of the conversation almost historically, so. But that's later on. For today, because it has usually been part of the conversation, let's talk about this idea of so-called active and inactive members. And part 3 says, in the Missouri Synod, as in many churches, there's often been that conversation. And at one time, our stewardship department had wanted to know who's in these categories for statistical purposes. And I always said to Pastor Soltis, we have people in our congregation who are active but not members, and we have people in our congregation who are not members and who are members but are not active. So what do you want to know? And he would, nobody knows what they want. So I told him we could, like I said there, the bullet points. We have people who are similar levels of activity in the church, whether or not they're officially considered communicant members. We have people who've never officially become members of the church, who are considerably more active in the congregation than some who have become communicant members. Okay, so there are people who are here quite frequently. Whatever you want. If you even want to just say, what does active mean? They come to church once a month or so. We have people who do that and have never actually officially joined the congregation, but they're here at least once a month. Maybe more often, but they've never actually joined the congregation. And yet, there are people who have officially joined the congregation who are almost never here. Okay? So, what do you do with that? I don't know. Okay? If we had a cemetery, then we'd have a better idea as to what the implications are, because sometimes the implications are, if you're a member, you get to be buried in the church cemetery. But then I still don't know what that means, because then you have to define membership more closely, I guess. And then we have some communicant members who are, and I've said this before, we've got at least one, who is 100% faithful in his chosen level of activity. He's here every Christmas Eve and every Easter. He's never here otherwise, but every Christmas Eve and every Easter for 37 years, every year. But he's here 100% for his chosen level of activity. He's got perfect attendance. It's like, how can I fault that? I can't fault that. None of us are 100% perfect attendance for our chosen level of activity. That's like, not even me. I've been sick a couple of times. So what are you gonna do? So turn to the second page. Let's just do this little exercise. There's a checklist. Are you an active member of Christ the King? So there's a whole checklist of things. Check as many of the following as are true of you. Okay, so take a pen or pencil, and there's a couple of pencil things there. Okay. And mark everything that's true of you. Were you in worship this morning, or will you be a little bit later on? Were you in worship last week? Were you in worship here at Christ the King 2 weeks ago?
I can't remember that.
Yeah, I know.
I was thinking me.
I knew that was
I
coming.
got this in my calendar.
Were you in worship 3 weeks ago? And we're in worship 4 weeks ago, so think about that. And the same with Bible class. If you're in Bible class today, you can check that one. If you're not in Bible class right now, then you don't have to check that one. 2, 3, and 4 weeks ago. I came to catechism and coffee last Wednesday. Don't forget, I was there also, so I know who you are. And we have it on tape, so we can check. I was at the last church council meeting. Now, notice I don't say I'm a member of church council. I was at the last church council. I count offerings. I serve as an usher. I didn't, Richard, I apologize. I pushed buttons. I should have done You can
Like
add
the
that
other
as an
music.
extra.
I
Well,
play-
yeah.
yeah,
And
Yeah,
now I
was
have,
gonna
I
say,
play the organ or other music, so there you
Yeah,
go.
that's
There you
right.
go.
I'll say extra.
Yeah,
There you go, I
extra.
play the organ or
That's
other
good.
music, there you go. I serve as communion assistant, I clean the church, set
I
up
came
and
to
take
catechism and coffee last Wednesday.
catechism and coffee last Wednesday. That's our Wednesday morning thing.
Oh, okay.
Count offerings, serve as usher, communion assistant, clean the church, set up and take it, play the organ or other music, that's Richard. Ed can check that also, because sometimes he plays other music. I came to the Easter brunch to eat. Or I contributed some food to the Easter brunch, because, you know.
I very seldom get to eat.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
How about this one? I think I'm here in worship almost every Sunday.
Physically,
Huh?
Yeah.
physically or mentally?
Yeah,
Oh, that's a whole nother.
that's right.
That's a whole nother.
We'll work on physical.
I think I'm here in worship about 50% of the time.
See, we can check all of those, 150
Yeah.
and 25, right?
Check those.
Yeah.
Or how about this one? I think I'm here in worship most of the time that I'm in town, except of course that I'm not in town sometimes, like in the winter or in the summer when I'm out of town.
No.
I put an offering envelope in the plate whenever I'm in worship. If I'm not at worship, I catch up my offerings when I get back, or I mail them in. And I tithe my income to the offerings of Christ the King, whether I'm present or not. That means 10%, by the way, whatever your income is 10%. Now, add up all the check marks and put the total at the end on that line.
So if we're here all the time, then we don't check the 50% and the 25%.
I don't care what you do. You can check it, or you can not check it.
would.
You can
Yeah,
check it or you
check
can
them
not
all.
check
Yeah.
If you're here 100%, you're 50, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the 25.
it. You
I
can
changed
check it
my
or you
total.
cannot check it.
Yeah, I know.
I can find white out if you need it.
I just, here most of the time.
Add up all the check marks and put the total on the line there. Now, I'm gonna tell you something really important right now. I don't really wanna know what your total is, cause I don't really care what your total is. I mean, I think it's fine, whatever you're doing, you know, I love you all, you're doing great. But the question at the bottom then is, how many check marks do you need to be considered an active member?
One.
One?
Yeah.
That many?
You were in worship this morning, you were here. Or you're looking at it in 2 months, you were there, you're here.
Okay. Okay. That's all right, I'm fine with me. You know, so more than one, then you're an overachiever, is that? So there you go. You know, I don't even, you know, so we talk, I guess my point with this is we talk about active, inactive members, and I don't even know what those words mean sometimes. You know, we used to have those words, and we used to talk about them a lot, actives and inactives. I don't even know what they mean. In fact, there was a whole conference a long time ago that was in the Missouri Synod, ministry to inactives, and I went to that. It was like, we, you know, at the end of the, by the time we were done, we still didn't know what those words meant. You know, how do we do that? The Pew Research Group recently decided that for research purposes, they would classify a person who calls himself a Christian must also attend worship at least monthly to be considered practicing. Less than that, they consider him non-practicing. So there are a lot of people out there who say, well, I'm a Christian, but I just don't go to church. Well, you're a non-practicing Christian. Well, okay. I don't know how to, for whatever reason, they're not in church, but there's a lot of people.
You know, I'm gonna bring up some personal views here. This reminds me of my dad,
Okay,
good Roman Catholic, but considered himself Roman Catholic.
sure.
But he, for a while, he didn't even go to church. Finally, what happened, I had to put him in a nursing home. And then the priests and the nuns were always around him, and he's talking to the priests and nuns all the time, good Roman Catholic again. So I don't, and throughout all the years that he was with me, throughout his life, he was always criticizing the Roman Catholic Church, but yet he was really Roman Catholic.
Yeah,
So by going to have a perfect attendance to a church is what the person considers the denomination that they belong to. So if you have a member here that attends once every 20 years, I'm Crescent King, that's my church, and I'm a member. So
Yeah.
what, I mean,
They're probably
it's
not.
and they believe it, I mean, so how can you judge it? We can't judge people as in their heart, what they believe.
and, you know, to a certain extent, that's true. And to a certain extent, that's, I think, as I understand it, that's kind of the classic, help me out here, but isn't that the classic Catholic definition of a parish? It's like, so you have a church, and you have the church building, and the parish is the geographic area, and all the Catholic people within that geographic area are members of that parish, regardless of how often they show up to Mass. Is that right, pretty much?
Your Easter duty once a year and confession and communion at
Yeah.
least once a year.
Yeah. Yeah, so you darken the doorstep a couple of times a year, and you can be buried from that church because but you're considered a member of that parish.
Correct.
And then there are some who are like the little old ladies who are there every day for Mass.
Right.
And
I
but,
had an aunt that went to church every day, most every
Yeah.
day, and come home and whip her kids with a coat hanger.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But then there are others who are there for Easter duty and their confession, and that's it.
That's it.
But the priest still is obligated to say they're a member of this parish. Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and they can be buried in the cemetery.
And they can be buried in cemetery.
And then the priests always say, this has happened to my dad already. Will my child, or my son,
Yeah,
come back every week? Please come
Yeah,
back. We
yeah.
we have an open door for you. So, of course, my dad never did.
yeah,
But he considered himself Roman Catholic. But
Right.
I'm just throwing this up because I don't know what to tell you, who is really a member here? Now, when I was a delegate here, it was 150, which was back in 2015. Of what you're defining as an active or an inactive members here, it might be half.
Well, see, and then that's the other part of the story too. I mean, you know, in the classic Catholic pattern, it's almost a geographic thing, right?
Mhm.
So we could say that the parish of the Catholic Church in Lodi has certain boundaries in Lodi. So theoretically, if that's the case, there's a Lodi parish, there's a Medina parish, there's a West Salem parish, for instance. So theoretically, if we did the same thing, you, for instance, would not be in the Lodi parish, you'd be in the Medina parish.
Right, 118.
Yeah, and Joanne would be in a Medina parish rather than a Lodi parish. You wouldn't be necessarily free to come all the way here to come to this, you could be free to come to this church, but you'd still be considered to be a member of that Medina parish rather than the Lodi parish in that classic pattern. Am I right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So,
Now,
but
like-
that's not the way we do it. What we have is we have people who don't live within, say, the boundaries of what would be considered a classic geographic parish. We have people who live in Medina, the far north part of Medina, Nova. You know, we used to say we had people in West Salem, we got people in Nova now.
No.
You know, Nova,
Nova.
Seville, okay, so our you know, our line, you know, West Salem, Nova, so our parish is like, you know, so the geographic boundaries are like, forget that. You know, so that just doesn't make any sense, and that's generally true for a lot of Protestant churches. I mean, we used to have people in Chicago that would drive for an hour to get to church, because they had belonged there and then moved out to outer suburbs and just kept driving, you know, just kept driving. But yeah, that's, so membership takes on a different meaning. And yes, a lot of it in the old days used to have to do with who gets to vote in the meetings and who gets to be buried in the church cemetery, or in, you know, the Lutheran cemetery, or in Holy Cross. If you didn't have a cemetery at the Catholic Church, who gets to be buried in Holy Cross up in Cleveland?
Who you know,
Yeah, yeah, who you know.
who you know. In the Roman Catholic Church,
Yeah.
you had to pay off certain people to get in. I'm telling you how old it is.
Yeah.
I know when my
Contributions,
dad died,
that's
the reason why he wanted to be buried Roman Catholic, so I respected his wishes. I paid $125 for the priest, I could have paid $250, I could have got the bishop up.
Oh, see, well, there you go. There you go.
So-
And counting.
So there, but we're talking, again, we're talking about
Yeah.
administrative kinds of things here. Okay, I mean, those words are administrative words. And there's a question on the fourth page, or not the fourth page, the third page. It says, is it possible that the way membership and these kinds of terms are used are for administrative purposes? Turns out to be not very pastoral, you know, because it's, who gets to be buried in the cemetery and that kind of stuff. Is that the way, you know, those are administrative terms, because it's like who shows up on the spreadsheet, right? But is that a very pastoral way to think about people? Okay, so let's talk about on page 3, it's like, should there be these kinds of distinctives? How do we talk about active and inactive members? And here's a picture of an active, here's a distinction of active and inactive members. And how do we talk about those guys? Are there other distinctions that could be made in a Christian congregation that aren't maybe quite so belittling? Like, for instance, how about this one? How about males and females? Should we talk about males and females? Is there a pastoral way to minister in a congregation to males and females as opposed to females? Is that a distinction we should make on occasion? No?
Yes,
Yes?
Why?
because you're female and I'm a male, and we have different needs, goals.
Well, everyone does that.
Well, this is true, but I'm just saying between males and
Yeah.
females.
But like between you and Tom, your needs and goals could be vastly different
That's
too.
true too.
So are you gonna make that distinction?
No,
I think it comes down to they're splitting hairs.
Yes, but we do have a women's Bible study.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and, you know, so even though it's, you know, it is knee-jerk to say, no, we
The actual
shouldn't.
church service should not say,
Right.
okay, male
Right,
here,
male here,
female
female
here,
there.
then,
Yeah.
you know.
And we've
It's-
had a male show up.
Oh,
at the
sure,
women's
and
Bible
there, and
study.
nobody has been, you know, and nobody has said, out, you know. But, and I don't think it would be.
Yeah.
No, but
Yeah,
aside from the church service, there are
Right.
some ministry distinctions that could be made because, at times, because they're useful.
Yeah, I can understand that, but I'm saying, you know, okay, yeah, you have one service that, you know, goes into this direction, okay, or something like that, or later on. But not every service is dictated that, okay,
All right.
well, today we're only doing
No, right,
this,
right.
and next week we're only doing this,
Right.
you know?
Here's another one. How about married or not married?
Again, same thing.
Okay. Normally, we wouldn't make that distinction, but there was a period of time when we had quite a few people who were, they were like Joe and Allie's age, but none of them were married. And Wayne and Jerry, were leading a Bible class with that group. Okay, and it was not a bad idea to have a group of people who were dating but not married as a Bible class. Okay, because there were special emphases that we wanted to make sure that we attended to with them, people who were unmarried but dating. And it was a good way to do that, to have a couple who was older and more mature and who had been through marriage and, and widowhood and so forth, to talk to them and lead them.
So you're talking about ministry possibilities.
Talk about ministry possibilities, yeah. Generally speaking, we may not want to make that distinction, but in terms of looking for a ministry possibility, it might not be a bad distinction to make sometimes, right?
That could be considered more life lessons.
And that could be the way of life lessons. Yeah. Here's another one. Okay. We make this distinction all the time. That's what Sunday school is, right? We put the kids in Sunday school, and it's Sunday school and then adults, right? So that's a ministry distinction that we make all the time. Except that in the worship service, people often ask me, do you have a children's sermon? And I was like, no, that's not something that I split out the kids. The kids are part of the thing, and we don't have a children's sermon.
I think if you had 15 or 20 children, it might make sense.
There might be a little bit different, yeah.
In each of these, at least that we've got so far, and I know some of the later ones are a little bit, but in each one, there has been, if we're talking ministry possibilities, some of it is ministry possibilities to the whole, to all people. And then could you, or should you, split out males and females? There could be ministry possibilities to everybody. We have the worship service and that kind of thing.
Right.
But there could be ministry possibilities to people who are unmarried, or to people who are married.
Well, and,
Or
Right, and-
under 20, everyone,
right,
and
and
then, right.
that's I guess what the point that I'm trying to get to here is that I'm not sure
Right.
how we say, what are the ministry possibilities if you start talking about active or inactive people. I think it's more realistic to say what kind of, how do we minister to one another and among one another if we're talking about children as opposed to adults. I'm not sure how we talk about and make those kind of distinctions among people. Say, you're just not very active. I don't know how to do that. How about baptized or not baptized people? Or, I couldn't find a good picture for someone who wasn't baptized, so I had a picture of something without water, Normally around here, people who aren't baptized are too young to have been baptized yet, but there have been a few who haven't been baptized who are older. And those are ones that we want to encourage to be baptized.
We don't have any.
Yeah, we don't have any right now.
Too young. You're
Yeah,
baptized babies.
yeah, I know,
You
I
could
know.
be a week old and be baptized.
Although, periodically, we have had people, it's curious that in our area what happens is we have people who kind of float down from Cleveland, and sometimes they have older kids, and they are maybe either Lutheran or they're from Catholic background, and they float into here and they go, oh, you know what, we never did have the kids baptized, now would be a good time to do it. And so we have had more older kids baptized than you might think, just because of that kind of phenomenon. They just never got around to having the babies baptized, and then when they float in here, they go, yeah, maybe we should do that.
But I don't think they're ever too young or too old.
No, they're never not.
No, we had his great nephew was baptized the week before he was confirmed,
Mm-hmm.
only because he lived with his mother in Columbus. She didn't believe in it when
Yeah.
he came to live with Dad.
Yeah,
Dad says, oh, no, no, no.
yeah, yeah. So there are those kind of things.
Right.
But we had a couple of Cub Scout families when we had the Cub Scouts a kid. They said, yeah, we never did this, we should do this. So we did. We have some people who are communing and some people who are not communing. Sometimes that's that's an opportunity for ministry. You know, as we talk to people who aren't community, we say, you know, let's discuss this for a while. You know, let's think about this. Here's one. Bald and not bald. We had Frank Garrick said something about this. He said, well, I'm bald. Well, here's a woman who's bald. So, well, now that's a good question. You know, there are occasions throughout the years here when occasionally some of the women have become bald for medical reasons. Okay? Because of chemotherapy. Okay, now, most of the time when men are bald, it's not because of chemotherapy, it just naturally happens. But when women become bald, it's because of chemotherapy. And that presents another occasion when, you know, because of ministry, compassion, whatever, that kind of stuff. You know, that maybe causes us to open our eyes a little bit and say, is there a place for us to say, here's a compassionate ministry need, you know, where we can go to our sister and say, how can we help you during this time? You know, is there things we can do? We've noticed, not because she's bald, but because we noticed that this is a consequence of something. Can we bring meals? Can we do transportation? Can we do the kinds of things? Can we sit with you while you're in your chemotherapy chair? All those kinds of things. What can we do?
You know, there's a fine line there. Because you don't want to, like, intrude in a private affair.
Sure.
And I don't know what to do. I mean, thinking about it, you don't want to hurt them, but yet you want to show compassion.
Right.
I don't know, it's a
Right.
fine line.
So that's a case where like as what is on the front of the worship folder, and like I was saying this morning, where that's a case where, as Martin Luther would have said, sin boldly. You know, you don't want to hurt their feelings, but you know, so just ask. Just say, I notice you're going through something. If there's anything that you need, you just ask me, and I'll be happy to help. And it can be that, John. And sometimes they'll say no, sometimes they'll say yes. There's a wonderful, and you just don't know. Some ladies, once the chemotherapy is done, their hair grows back, and I've said to them, is it God wonderful your hair is coming back? And they're like, oh yeah, God is great. You know, but there's another gal that I know who's a wonderful counselor who's up in Cleveland. She happens to be a black lady, but she never let it come back. I mean, she's saved it. She wears her baldness like a tattoo, you know, and she looks elegant, she looks wonderful, she's a mature lady, she looks elegant, she looks wonderful, she's a lovely, wonderful counselor, and everybody who looks at her goes, damn, Jackie, you know, but she wears it like a tattoo, and she owns it. And
But
she
a lot
does it
of
right.
that comes from within.
And that comes from within. And that comes from within.
Realizing I don't have to spend an hour every morning.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's
Well.
so much easier. And I still look good.
Yeah. You know, on the list there, I've included, you know, what about people, you know, is it helpful to make a distinction of people with insulin pumps or without insulin pumps? I didn't ask you if permission to put that on there, but, you know, not that that has to be a big ministry focus, but we're aware. Okay? We're aware. All right, how about this one? How about people who are wearing glasses and people who are not wearing glasses? Is that something that, you know, we need to be aware of? I don't know. Most of us are wearing glasses, even you who are not really needing it anymore. So
Well,
it's needed for that.
Better with these.
How about this one? People who are not needing mobility assistive devices, and how many, you know, and I said to Beth was like, what is this all about? And I said, how many people in this congregation are either using canes or walkers or have had knee replacements? You know, and we know this because they're not kneeling at the altar, you know, anymore. And as opposed to going to someplace like Grace Lutheran Church in Lakewood, which has like 500 steps, and, well, not many, not that many, but there's a whole mess of steps to go up, there's a whole mess of steps to go down, there's a chairlift on the, I mean, if we had that many people here, if I had that many steps here, we might have to do some serious thinking about, you know, some ADA adjustments to the building. You know, because we got a lot of people, and a lot of knees, and a lot of canes, and a lot of steps. And how do we minister to one another and do things together? You know? How do we do that? You know, a chairlift on the steps might not be the best thing. We might want to get rid of a whole stairwell and put in a big elevator instead. You know, that might be a better thing to do.
And then there's the line to get in.
Well,
Yeah.
Methodist Church downtown put in an elevator in the past year, so.
here in Lodi? Yeah.
I know when my mom was looking at churches in Medina, she just had to disqualify any that she couldn't get into because of the steps,
See, there we go.
so.
Well, if you have a barrier, you're more apt not to go as often.
That's right.
You have enough failures in life the way it is.
That's right. Well, that was one of the deals, you know, when we had the district convention at Grace. My dad had gone to lots of district and synodical conventions. Can we go to the district convention? It's like, you know what, I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, John has, every time we wanna go out to eat, oh, well, we can't go to that place, they got too many steps.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even any steps for some folks.
Yeah, John can hardly do, he can't even get up the curb without
Yeah.
holding on to something, so.
So how do we do ministry? How do we bring the gospel to people? And here's another one. English is a primary language and English is a secondary language.
That's a big thing in a lot of churches.
That's a big thing for a lot of churches. It's not so much in our immediate area, but in a lot of other places it is. The church that we left in Chicago, you know, it's more Hispanic speaking people, Spanish speaking people in that neighborhood than there are English speaking people. And so, you know, how do we do that? So what other kinds of distinctions might be helpful to think about without being belittling to people? How do we talk about people without being belittling
In terms of ministry.
in terms of ministry? Well, on the fourth page, here are some statements, because this ought to be a Bible study, so here are some Bible statements about Jesus. Okay, because we're coming down to the end of time. So let's read these. Mark 6:34. I don't know if it's possible to read them, because as it turns out, the blue came out kind of faded. But somebody try to read Mark 6:34, please.
When Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd.
Okay, thanks. And then Luke 4 says he went to Nazareth where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went to the synagogue and stood up to read in the scroll of the prophet, and he read this, verse 18. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. We heard that recently and said today the scriptures fulfilled in your hearing. Somebody read Matthew 11:28, please.
Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Thank you. And somebody read Mark 10, that paragraph there, please.
People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. when Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." And he took the children in his arms, placed his hands on them, and blessed them.
And then the last one, this is the end of the story of the prodigal son.
My son, the father said, "You are always with me, and everything I have is yours." But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.
Okay, thank you. So from these verses, Jesus saw that people were